I said, you're seeing Jesus on every page because you're looking at the Bible from pretty far away. But if you look close up, if you get really close to it, you won't see him anymore. And she got very upset with me. She said, what are you talking about? So I said, let's try an experiment. I said to her, take out your Bible, and I said, tell me who this passage is speaking about. I asked her to turn to the 13th chapter in the book of Zechariah, the 13th chapter of Zechariah, and the 6th verse. And she ran to get this verse. And what was amazing is in her Bible, this verse was underlined, it had a yellow highlighting through it, it had a big arrow pointing to it, and a star, and the whole thing like, boo, 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 amazing. So I asked her, who is it talking about? Now you have it on your sheet, she read the verse, and one shall say unto him, what are those wounds in thine hands? And he will answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. This, by the way, is one of the 12 minor prophets in the Jewish Bible. And it's not from the New Testament. So she looked at me and she said, you know who it's talking about. So I said, no, I'm asking you, who is this verse talking about? And she said to me, it's talking about Jesus. So I asked her, are you sure? She said, I'm positive. I said, how sure are you? I'm not exaggerating what she said now. She said, I would stake my life on it. I would stake my life on it. Now, my Bible here, this is a New American Standard Version Open Bible. They have a little black star next to every verse that they claim is a messianic prophecy about Jesus. And this verse has a black star next to it. Now, I'll tell you that most Christian scholars will readily admit that this is not talking about Jesus. But you should know that many Christian missionaries will insist it's one of these hundreds of prophecies that points to Jesus. So I asked her to do the following. I said, listen, you just read chapter 13, verse 6. I asked her to go back and read the entire chapter now. Read from chapter 13, verse 1. As she was reading this chapter, I was watching her face. And within about 30 seconds, her face turned white like a ghost. She literally turned white like a ghost. And I asked her, I said, what's the problem? And she gave a shriek. She said, she said, this can't be talking about Jesus. It can't be talking about him. I said, why not? She said, this chapter is talking about false messiahs. False prophets. It's talking about false prophets. So I said to her, but wait a second. About a minute ago, you said you would stake your life on the fact it was talking about Jesus. What happened? So that was a rhetorical question. She didn't answer that. But what happened here is very clear. When she first read the Bible, she really didn't relate that much to the book of Zechariah. What does she care from the book of Zechariah? So she's probably reading the Bible, she's going through it, okay, but then she hits this verse. What are those wounds in your hands? Well, she knows who that's talking about, so she circles this verse and underlines it in red and highlights and arrows and bells and whistles. Because again, she's reading the Bible with Jesus glasses on. So once you have Jesus glasses, you're going to see everything Jesus. Whenever we study the Bible seriously, what we do is we try to look at a text and find ambiguities and difficulties and problems. Anyone here that studies the Bible knows that this is what Bible study is about. You don't just read it. You try to look at the text and analyze it and find what might be difficult here. What sounds strange? What's peculiar? Let me give you two examples. We're going to be reading very soon in the book of Exodus. It's going to say, I think it's chapter 10, verse 1. I might be wrong. It says, very simply, Bo el Paro. Bo el Paro. Get any Bible translation on the planet. It will almost always translate those words as, go to Pharaoh. Go to Pharaoh. God says to Moses, go to Pharaoh. Now, everyone that knows Hebrew knows that that's not really the accurate translation. Bo el Paro means come to Pharaoh. So as you're reading this and you read it, you say, what do you mean come to Pharaoh? That doesn't make sense. You don't come to Pharaoh, you go to Pharaoh. So how do you resolve this problem? So one resolution is simply to say, well, it says one thing, but it means something else. That's a very legitimate question. What does it say? What does it mean? So it says, come to Pharaoh, but what it means is go to Pharaoh. Or, some commentaries will say that God is telling Moses, come together, we're going to go to Pharaoh. Right? Come with me, and I'll be with you when you go to Pharaoh. But the point I'm trying to make here is that there's an ambiguity in the text. It's a very strange way of telling Moses to go to Pharaoh by saying, come to Pharaoh. Or in this week's chapter, we're going to read, Pharaoh is very, very upset about the Jewish people. There are too many of them. There's always a problem. Too many Jews. So he's upset with the Jews. There are too many taking over the whole country. So Pharaoh says, Hava nidchakmolo. Literally, come, let's deal wisely with him. Wait a second. What it should have said is, not come, let's deal wisely with him. It should have said, come, let's deal wisely with them. So what do you do with this? So what you do is, you either translate it as, let's deal wisely with him, right, which is almost always the translation, and it's explained that either it's talking about Pharaoh is thinking, I'm going to deal wisely with him, with God, the protector of the Jewish people, or possibly, in the Jewish Bible we know that the nation of Israel is often referred to as a corporate entity. For example, God says about the Jewish people, B'ni Bechori Yisrael. My son, my firstborn is Israel, not my children, my son. So the Jewish people are often spoken about as a singular group. So if you look at the last reference on the bottom of page 1, we have one of these passages that is difficult. From the prophet Hosea, chapter 6, verse 2, he will heal us after 2 days. On the third, he will raise us up, and we will live before him. Now, that's not an easy verse to understand. You have a legitimate right to scratch your head and say, what's going on here? What does this mean? So when we study the Bible, we're interested in finding these ambiguities and these difficulties and these anomalies. But think about for a second, what do conspiracy theorists do? What do conspiracy theorists do? They always begin by pointing out a question. Why didn't Flight 77 make a hole in the Pentagon as wide as the wingspan of the 757, which is 124 feet wide? Why wasn't there a hole that wide in the Pentagon? Good question. Why did Building 7 at the World Trade Center collapse when the original assessment by FEMA was that there wasn't a lot of damage there? That's a good question. And the conspiracy theorists will raise many such questions about what happened at 9/11. And when they think about all these questions, there's one very obvious and simple answer. It's the Jews! How else can you explain this? It's the Jews! So what happens in the conspiracy theorist world is that the conspiracy theorist begins with their obsession. They begin with their craziness, with their obsession. And then they find issues, questions to raise, right? These are legitimate questions. And then they read their obsession back into any question on the topic. We know there's something called the law of parsimony. Occam's razor, whatever his name is. I think that they say in medical school, the doctors are taught, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. So when someone has a cough, you probably will think about a cold, not SARS. So this is a very, very simple rule of logic. And therefore, the most reasonable explanation is often the simplest and most elegant explanation. What the missionary does is to take any problem in the Bible and say, well, it's got to be Jesus. So here, this passage in Hosea, he will heal us after 2 days. On the third, he will raise us up and we will live before him. It's got to be talking about the resurrection of Jesus. On the third day, he's resurrected from the dead. Now, this explanation of the passage makes some very critical mistakes. If you read the 6th chapter of Hosea, and even the chapters before it, this entire passage and the entire book before it is dealing with the relationship between the Jewish people and God, and how the Jewish people strayed away from God, and how in this chapter they begin to return to God, and they say, the Jewish people, it's obviously a plural here, it's not talking about one person, but they say, he'll heal us after 2 days, on the third day he'll raise us up. So the most illogical answer is say, oh, it's got to be talking about Jesus. Where do you get him from? When it's talking about the Jewish people. So commentaries have offered dozens of possible explanations. Maybe it's referring to the second temple that were destroyed, and then the third temple is referring to, or the first and second exiles, and there'll be a return after the third exile. There are many ways of dealing with this using Occam's razor.